It's September of 1813 in a wooden church called Stony Creek, tucked into the hills of Scott County, Virginia. A woman named Susanna Kitchen is on her feet in the middle of a church meeting, and she is furious. She's not upset about a sermon. She's upset because another church member, a woman named Susanna Stallard, has been going around saying that Kitchen has been harboring a group of outsiders. The word Stallard uses for them, written right there in the church minutes, is melangenes. Nobody in the room explains what that word means. Nobody has to. Everybody already knows exactly who she's talking about. And this petty argument between two women in a small Baptist church over gossip is the very first time in recorded history that the word melungeon gets written down. It will take 200 years, an entire legal system built to sort human beings into boxes, and eventually a lab technician with a cotton swab to figure out what that word actually meant. To understand why harboring someone is a big enough deal to fight about in church, you have to go back further. By the early 1700s, Virginia and North Carolina are writing law after law that sorts people strictly by blood. If the law calls you white, you keep your land, your vote, and your right to stand up in a courtroom and be believed. If the law calls you anything else, you start losing all three, one at a time. And anything else keeps getting redefined more broadly every few decades. Free black families, indigenous survivors of a century of war and disease, poor European settlers who marry outside the lines the law just drew for them. So these families do the one thing that actually works. They leave, not to somewhere better, to somewhere the government can't be bothered to climb after them. They push up into the ridges around the Cumberland Gap, onto land so steep and so useless for farming that no sheriff, tax assessor, or land speculator wants to make the hike. Therefore, by the time Susanna Kitchen is yelling in a Baptist church in 1813, there is already a mixed ancestry community that's been living up in those mountains for generations, African, indigenous, and European ancestry, all folded together, hiding in plain sight above the fog line. The valley folks have clearly noticed them for years. They just didn't have one tidy word to call them until now. And once the word exists, it does not stay polite. Melungeon spreads fast as an insult, something you call a neighbor to imply their family is hiding a shameful bloodline, which, in 17 and 1800s Virginia, is not just rude. It's dangerous, because being called something is nowhere near as dangerous as being officially written down as something, and the part of this story where that gets a lot worse is coming up next. Here are the actual stakes in plain numbers. In this legal world, there are basically three boxes a clerk can put your name in: white, free person of color, or enslaved. Only one of those three boxes lets you vote, testify in court against a white person, marry freely, or leave land to your kids without a lawyer picking the will apart for the next 50 years. So if you're a Melungeon family with African, indigenous, and European ancestors all mixed into one gene pool, you've got a very practical problem. The truth is not a box you can safely check. Therefore, sometime in the early 1800s, a new story starts circulating through these mountain communities. The story is that they aren't black, and they aren't quite native either. They're Portuguese. Some versions say their ancestors were shipwrecked Mediterranean sailors who washed up on the coast generations back and just kept walking inland until the land got steep. Other versions swap in Turkish blood, or gypsy blood, or a quiet Cherokee grandmother nobody can quite name. None of this is random. Portuguese, specifically, is a genius move, because under the racial logic of the time, someone from Southern Europe can be dark-haired, dark-eyed, and olive-skinned and still get filed under white on the census. A Melungeon family claiming Portuguese blood isn't spinning a fun little legend for its own sake. They're building a legal shield out of a story, one generation at a time. And for a good long while, in a lot of county courthouses, it actually works. But then, in 1924, Virginia passes the Racial Integrity Act, built around something called the one-drop rule. meaning any trace of African ancestry, no matter how small, legally makes you black. The man enforcing it, Virginia's first state registrar of vital statistics, a bureaucrat named Walter Plecker, spends years combing through birth and marriage records, reclassifying people by hand, and along the way tries to erase the entire legal category of Indian from Virginia's paperwork. Imagine spending 100 years building your legal identity around one story, and then a single man with a rubber stamp decides your grandmother's birth certificate said the wrong thing. So the Portuguese story doesn't just survive Plecker's purge. It becomes more important than ever. Families tell it to census takers, to school teachers, to their own children, generation after generation. And here's the part that makes this a genuinely sad kind of clever. The lie works so well for so long that eventually the people telling it aren't lying anymore. They believe it. Grandma isn't running a strategic cover story at the dinner table. Grandma is just telling you where the family comes from. By the time you reach their great-great-grandchildren in the 20th century, where Portuguese isn't a defense mechanism anymore, it's identity. It's just who they are. But this story, the one that kept an entire people whole and legally safe for 200 years, is about to meet something that doesn't care about court records, doesn't care about family legend, and does not forgive a good lie just because it was necessary. It's about to meet a Q-tip. Fast forward to the 2000s, and a new kind of person starts showing up in Melungeon family stories. The genealogist. Amateur historians and professional researchers start digging through old court records and church minutes, yes, including that 1813 complaint from Stony Creek Baptist, trying to trace exactly where these families actually came from. And a few of them start doing something the 1800s legal system never had access to. They start collecting DNA. In 2012, a researcher named Roberta Estes, working with a small team, publishes a study in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy titled Melungeons, a Multi-Ethnic Population. They test the Y DNA and the mitochondrial DNA of the core historical Melungeon families, the father's line and the mother's line, the two threads of ancestry that can't lie, because they've never once heard of a courthouse. And the results come back. On the father's side, European and African ancestors in roughly equal number. On the mother's side, every single tested line traces straight back to Europe, specifically Northern and Central Europe. Not Portugal, not Turkey. And in these core families, not one confirmed direct paternal or maternal Native American line either. The actual factual origin of the Melungeon people is sub-Saharan African men and Northern European women having children together in colonial America at a time and in a place where that was against the law, which means the 200-year story, the shipwrecked sailors, the exotic Mediterranean blood, the quiet, unnamed Cherokee grandmother, was built specifically to hide the one ancestry that turns out to have been sitting right there in the genetic record the entire time. The lie wasn't covering for nothing. It was covering for exactly the truth everyone had been most afraid of. Something about that is almost too neat to be real. But therefore, when the results go public, the reaction isn't relief. It's grief. People who built a family identity around a Portuguese sailor or a Cherokee ancestor don't get to just shrug and update the family tree over breakfast. Roberta Estes puts the reaction simply. In her words, there were a whole lot of people upset by this study. They just knew they were Portuguese or Native American. Some had heard that story told at funerals. Some had it inked onto their own arm. And now a lab in a strip mall was telling them, very politely, that Grandma had been wrong the whole time. Or, more precisely, that Grandma had been right to lie and had simply lied so well for so long that the lie eventually became the only thing left standing. So look at what actually happened here. A colonial legal system, built entirely on sorting human beings into boxes, forced a real community into hiding in a mountain range. That same system then forced them to build a 200-year lie just to survive it. It took Virginia's own legislature until 2001 to formally admit the Racial Integrity Act was dressed-up racism wearing a lab coat, and until 2020 to finally repeal what was left of it on the books. 2 centuries after that argument in a Baptist church, it wasn't a magistrate, or a mob, or a man with a rubber stamp who finally told the Melungeons the truth about themselves. It was a cotton swab and a technician with a clipboard. The lie invented to protect them from being seen as exactly what they were is the same thing a DNA test, with zero interest in anyone's feelings, walked in 200 years later and confirmed. Not sure if that's justice, tragedy, or just the universe being a little bit petty 2 centuries late. But let us know what you think in the comments, and whether you'd rather know the truth or just keep believing your grandmother.